Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams. Thanks for joining me again, Daniel.
Hi, Jay. It's good to be with you again.
It is always good to talk to you, and I would like to start out this week by discussing the anniversary of the Ukrainian overthrow of the elected government. I guess it's been 1 year now, so how are things looking now that the U.S. NGOs went in there and destabilized things and made everything good again? Of course, we waved the flag for America in the Ukraine. We're very happy that the will of the people was not allowed to go forward because those people are so stupid over there. They don't know what they're doing, so they needed our help, right?
Yeah, the freedom, democracy, and economic progress has broken out all over the place. But I mean, I think there are some bright points now, but it is, you're right, it's a good time to reflect on what happened and how it happened and the role that the U.S. did play and admits to have played. Even Obama said, I think we discussed this, said a couple of weeks ago that we did help broker the transition in power. So he admitted the U.S. role. I think it was Ambassador Samantha Power, or maybe it was Jen Psaki, the State Department spokesman, who said, nobody is saying the U.S. didn't have any role in this.
Yeah.
So certainly the U.S. was involved. It was a two-tiered coup where there was the people in the streets who were quickly supplanted by violent people in the streets. And I don't know if you noticed this, Jay, but the BBC had of all places, which has been one of the worst propaganda outlets, but it even featured someone who was a protester in Ukraine, in Kiev, in the Maidan, who said that he was using live firearms and shooting at the policemen. He said he didn't mean to kill any of them, but he was shooting at them. So I think there's some truth starting to come out a little bit, but I think the official numbers are 5,600 people that have been killed in the violence. I think that the numbers that I've seen are much, much higher than that, and maybe upwards of even 50,000 people that have been killed. And many of them were killed in eastern Ukraine. They were civilians. They happened to live in the wrong part of the country, and the government that was backed by the U.S. has been shelling them.
Well, I thought it was just the Russians that are doing the shelling.
Well, that's amazingly enough, Poroshenko, who is the fellow that the U.S. is backing in power as a president now, he even went down to the Maidan Square today to commemorate it, where he was actually booed. There's a video of him being booed by some people, but where he said, all the violence on the Maidan Square was all orchestrated by the Russians. They were all behind this whole thing, which, he's sounding increasingly deranged, that everything is theirs. And then he claimed that there were, or not him, but his military spokesman, Lysenko, said, claimed that there were 20 new Russian tanks that had come into Ukraine just in the past 24 hours. And even the French president, Hollande, had to say that he's seen no indication of that being the case. So it's a terrible tragedy. And, Jay, the work that we do for the Ron Paul Institute, and what Ron Paul himself says is essentially, the people in certain parts of the country didn't go along with the coup, and they wanted to secede. And if they had been allowed to simply do that, to federalize and to secede, then probably these two different parts would be trading with each other. They would have productive relations. None of this had to happen, and it's just a real terrible tragedy.
So if we look back a year ago, things are worse or better than they were a year ago?
Well, they're far worse for all the people who died and whose family members were killed. They're far worse for even remember that the troops that are being used by the U.S.-backed government in Kiev, these are conscripts for the most part. They don't want to be there. They tried to call up another group of young men to show up, and only 6% of those called actually showed up.
Wow.
So it shows you that this is not a popular war. These kids are being forced into this. They passed a law saying that deserters are shot.
Wow.
And of all places, foreign policy, which often has some fairly decent realist-oriented articles. They even ran an article a couple of days ago outlining this massive group of, they call them draft dodgers, but people who don't want to go fight in this war. So in many sense, these guys are also the victims of their own governments. So it's much worse off for all the cities that have been flattened in the east. all the industry, all the commerce that will never take place or will take so long to rebuild. So it's just an absolute disaster. It's great for groups like the IMF. It's great for people like Joe Biden's son, who's in business now in Ukraine. It's certainly great for the U.S. military-industrial complex, who can't wait to start sending over weapons to Ukraine. So as usual, some do benefit from these kinds of wars.
But what you're telling me is that there just is not a popular consensus for Ukraine. That is from the people to so-called to protect themselves. In essence, you're saying that there's a draft and nobody wants to go. Who wants to go into war? I mean, I think you have to be deranged to want to go into war. But normally, if there is a sense that you're endangered, there would be, I would think, a willingness to defend yourselves. Most people would do that if they felt the need to, right? So why is this so unpopular among the Ukrainian young men?
Exactly. If you're absolutely right, Jay. If you were threatened, you'd take up arms. Even those of us who are not keen on violence would take up arms to defend our families. So the fact that they're not doing that, I think, is certainly an indication. The other thing is, there was this. It's called a cauldron. Where this city was cut off. Debaltseve it was called. And this was a scene of some really horrific fighting that just ended this past couple of days. But you had about at least 5,000 guys, soldiers, Ukrainian, from Kiev, from the U.S. backside, that were trapped in there after they were encircled. Essentially, this President Poroshenko just left them to hang out to dry.
Really?
And what I think may well happen in the next few days or few weeks, these guys, these several thousand that were able to escape, they left, of course, all their weapons. But those that were able to escape, they're going to go back home. They're going to talk to their relatives, their friends, their colleagues. And I think when word gets out how badly they were treated by their own government, how they were left to hang out to dry and shot, I think you may well see an uprising against the current government. You may well see this guy overthrown. He's hated by the people who are against the war, and he's also hated by the radicals on the other side, those are the ones you see carrying the fascistic type of emblems. They hit him for not going hard enough.
Yeah.
So he's going to be in a pincher mood, and his days may well be numbered.
Well, then we can hope that something better takes place, but I'm not sure that that the U.S. is interested in something better taking place, or the Anglo-American Empire, like to call it, or NATO.
Well, speaking of the Anglo part, you're interesting, Jay, that the defense secretary of the UK said this week that Russia is more dangerous to Europe than ISIS. So,
oh my goodness!
The Anglo part. But what I think is slightly encouraging is that the French and Germans did surprise the Americans in the UK, and it irritated the U.S. But they went over to Moscow. They went over to Kiev. They brokered a deal that, while it's not perfect, offers some hope and is tentatively holding. And, the U.S. is furious. I don't know if you saw this, but there was apparently Victoria Nuland, who was the original, if you remember, her phone call was originally hacked, where she said some creative things about the Europeans. She spoke at this Moscow security conference last week and apparently was just steaming over the fact that Germany and France had the audacity to try to reach out on their own and try to make peace. We're supposed to be in charge of that.
Well, I guess we are. We still have troops, at least in Germany, so we have to keep them under control, I suppose. But why would Germany and France have sovereignty? I mean, why would they have the right? I mean,
they're only just in the neighborhood, so they don't have any concern about. Right?
Yeah, they're only directly affected by the sanctions and so forth. Well, we'll certainly, this will be a story that's going to have, we're going to be talking about some more Ukraine, unfortunately. It just would be nice if it went away and peace would break out, but obviously, as you point out, there's lots of people who are not interested in peace. Let's switch a little to another part of the world, Syria. You talked about a U.S. ambassador sort of turned his views around with respect to arming some of the rebels there, right?
Yeah, it was very interesting. Ambassador Robert Ford, who really should be faulted as the father of U.S. policy, regime change policy towards Syria. He was the very first who reached out to the rebels trying to overthrow Assad. He was the one who urged most strongly the U.S. to back these rebels. We've got to get behind them. We've got to take Assad out. And so the U.S. foreign policy did follow his lead, and he was the most enthusiastic supporter, even joining these rebels in the streets. Now, after the place is an absolute disaster, a disaster that he had a big hand in causing, all of a sudden he says, you know what? I don't really think it's a good idea anymore to arm these rebels. He said, this is a quote for him from this week. For a long time, we looked the other way while the Nusra Front and armed groups have coordinated military operations against the regime. I think the days of us looking the other way are finished. He's basically saying there are no moderates. There is no free Syrian army that are fighting for democratic values. We've been lying to ourselves and to the rest of the world for so long, and now it's really time to come clean. There's no way he said, well, how are these guys even going to achieve this victory? What are they going to do with 5,000 guys? So basically, he's also admitting that this is not a popular uprising. If they can't even get enough troops, it shows that it's not supported by the population. And he ends by saying, if we can't fix this thing and do it right, he said, quote, then we'll just have to walk away and say there's nothing we can do about Syria.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, isn't this an example, a horrific example of the incredible cynicism of the foreign policy establishment, who in Washington, that your policies have destroyed a country and left so many thousands dead, and then you just shrug your shoulders and say, hey, there's nothing more we can do for you.
Yeah.
Too bad.
Well, would that we would follow his advice and just walk away, but it doesn't look like there's many people in the military-industrial complex at all interested in that. And why would they be? Because they're making their fortunes by killing people, right?
Yeah, and it's ironic. Just as the guy who created this horrible policy says it's terrible and it's not going to work, we also read this week that the U.S. and Turkey have signed a deal to train yet more Syrian rebels.
Wow.
And the ambassador already said that, these guys are joining ISIS, they're joining Al-Qaeda, they're taking our weapons with them. We even saw this week a picture with some ISIS guys with some EU rocket launchers. So they're capturing these weapons, they're taking them, they're using them against theoretically even against the U.S. And yet, more of the same. This is the interventionists. Even no matter how bad it goes, more of the same. Double down.
Double down. Well, that's what we've talked about before, and I just keep going back to the economic front when the same sort of doubling down on money creation by the Federal Reserve. It just seems to me that there's, if we wanted to create problems, if we wanted to destroy countries and destroy our own country in the process, if that was the intent, we couldn't do a better job than what we're doing. So it just doesn't make any sense at all. Here we go. Another on the ISIS front here. I see there was some discussion here from Wesley Clark also about how we've sort of helped create ISIS or helped fund them, I guess, or one of our allies. What's the story on Wesley Clark?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something we wrote about a little bit this week. Anyone else saying it would be, if Ron Paul had said it, they would have said, "Oh, here is another crazy conspiracy theory."
Right.
But here's a real insider, General Wesley Clark, who is in a position to know a lot of these things. He said he was on CNN this last week, and he said, "Well, you got to know that some of our closest allies in the Middle East created and funded ISIS to help fight against Hezbollah." And he said, when you're fighting against a power like Hezbollah, you don't want. Basically, he said, you don't want to get a bunch of schoolboys. You got to get some real tough guys, tough SOBs to do this.
Yes.
So that's why they had to form. That's why they had to back ISIS. And then he said, but it's turned into a Frankenstein monster.
Yeah.
There's interventionism right there,
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what we're doing, creating Frankenstein monsters, and at least if the videos are to be believed, large numbers of Christians now being beheaded. And the Pope spoke out and obviously is concerned about it. And I read this week that there may be some concern, Italy is concerned about ISIS infiltration somehow connected to Libya. Could you explain that?
Yeah, here's another example. I mean, we sound like a broken record, I guess, but Italy and France and the UK, they were all the biggest supporters of this NATO attack on Libya back in 2011.
Hmm.
They said we've got to go in there, we've got to, take out Gaddafi, we've got to spread democracy, and it's going to be a cakewalk. The French philosopher Bernard Henri Levy, who was one of the biggest forces behind pushing for this attack. He said there's going to be, a new wind of democracy blowing in the region if we can only start bombing them. And look what this has produced. There was no ISIS in Libya before the U.S. attack, just like there was no Al Qaeda in Iraq before the U.S. invasion. So these things have produced this. And now Italy is telling us it's worried about ISIS. Well, shouldn't you think these things through?
Hmm. Well, not if it gets in the way of profits from killing people, no.
Exactly, and as Dr. Paul has discussed several times, this is how the neocons react when you show them, a picture of the disaster their policy have created. They just shrug it off and say, "Hey, you didn't go in hard enough. You didn't drop enough bombs."
That's always. It couldn't be that they were wrong to start with; that their premise was wrong.
But Stoltenberg, the new Secretary General of NATO, he was quoted this past week saying, it's not our fault that Libya is a disaster. We were told to bomb it, and we bombed it. It's not our fault that nobody fixed it up afterward.
Oh my goodness!
So nobody takes responsibility for the disasters they create.
Well, how real do you think this threat might be to Italy?
Well, I think it certainly could be real. They're a lot closer to Libya than we are. Who's going to stop some guys from getting on a boat if they decide to do it? Wouldn't be difficult to do if they feel that it's in their interest. So, again, they should think these things through. They need to get out of the echo chamber and stop believing their own propaganda. They're in this weird sort of endless loop where everyone reinforces everyone else's worst and weirdest fantasies about the world.
Mm-hmm.
Need to get real.
Well, and getting real is something that I don't think anybody in charge is about to do. I read in the not in the Financial Times, the New York Times today, headline, front page, on terror, gentle hand or iron fist. In other words, don't even think about moving America's troops out of places, but how do we handle these people? Should we be nice and kind to them, or should we just really give them hell? And again, neither one is going to work because, as Ron Paul noted, as the CIA's noted, the reason they came over here on 9/11 is because we're over there. And,
exactly.
And Daniel, what troubles me so much is that we're seeing more and more people of Islamic background taking up a radical, becoming, from the West, joining ISIS and other radical movements.
Sure, exactly. And I think people that know a lot about this, like Michael Scheuer would say, it's how they perceive the U.S. as this kind of crusader force going into their part of the world. And you're right, either a iron fist or gentle hand. I think the administration said this week the real problem with people joining these groups is they need to have more job opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
As if it's just so simple. Open a Walmart, and all of these guys are gonna just. We've already created this monster.
Well, of course, the ruling elite have no place for culture, for respective cultures, different societies. They think that they have the answers for everything. There's no way that Christian societies should exist, or Muslim societies should exist, or anybody that believes anything other than their religion, the religion of the ruling elite. So. I'm going to be going to a very interesting play in New York City. It's called Disgraced. Actually, it is about professional person of Islamic background who rose to become a very successful Wall Street lawyer. It reveals his inner feelings about 9/11 and how his background as a Muslim. And I think it should be very, very interesting. I saw the interview with the playwright, with Charlie Rose, and I would suggest maybe to people listening to this, you might want to check this out. If you just check out Charlie Rose's interview with the playwright of this play, and his name escapes my memory, but the play is Disgraced. So if you do a Google, Daniel, I think it's something you would really enjoy seeing as well. Because it really is. It goes to the heart of, try to put yourself in the place of somebody who was brought up Muslim, and then you've joined the U.S. society. You've become an American now, and you're supposed to put all that religious belief behind, and you're not supposed to, those values that you were taught, you're supposed to just throw them away, and just join the secular humanist culture of America. And and clearly this fellow had a hard time doing it. That's what the play's about. But I think it's something to think about, and the whole notion that we should just tell other people how to live their lives. Of course, that's what we're doing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else, Daniel, you might want to just note this week that we might keep our eyes on? What do you think might be important in the coming week?
Well, you're probably following this more closely than I am, Jay, and you understand it better than I'm sure, but I'm still fascinated by Greece, and it looks like there's been a capitulation on the part of the new Greek government. So it'll be interesting to see how the Greek voters feel when if as it appears now, and of course they've been changing on an hourly basis, but if as it appears they have been sold out and they go for another extension. Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating.
Well, it is. My understanding of that, though, Daniel, is that the Germans are not ready to go along with it, in part because they didn't formally sign off on it. And so there's a little cat and mouse game being played here. But I think you're right. There's an awful lot of Greek people who are not very happy about a capitulation, if that's what's going on. So I agree. I think that's a very important thing to watch. All of these things impact the markets that I watch, of course, in either directly or indirectly. And of course, the biggest impact is, as our friend Jeff Deist has said many times, in politics it's perception more than reality, or perception becomes reality. And one of the things that I find, Daniel, is that the propaganda from our side is just incredible. And I was reading this past week from the Council of Foreign Relations. There's an article that said how to beat back the Kremlin propaganda. Uh-huh. So we don't engage in propaganda. We just engage in truth in America. It's all the other countries that engage in propaganda when they say things we don't agree with or our ruling elite doesn't agree with, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I really thought that when I was a kid growing up during the Cold War, and I believed in my government, and I believed that the Russians were evil, and I'm not trying to say there were anything good about them, the communist dictatorship.
Yeah.
But to think that we never engage in any kind of spin, and now we go back and realize that Edward Bernays and others were involved very much in helping to form American opinion about the CIA, things like that going on. So
I think it's expected, in the government-funded outlets that they're going to have some spin. But what disturbs me most in the West and in the U.S., Jay, is the fact that all of these so-called private media, they're absolutely in lockstep with the government lines.
Yeah.
That's what bothers me. If Voice of America, which is funded by the Americans, spouts the U.S. propaganda line, that's fine. That's how they're paid. But what about CNN and ABC and NBC and all these guys?
Right.
The exact same thing.
Right. Well, that's more dangerous in a way because they are pretending to be open-minded, free, independent thinkers. Yeah. And they're anything but that. And in fact, in the article from the Council of Foreign Relations, they were talking about how Putin is, he's just a dictator with respect to the media. And that we are not, of course. We're free here. And, nothing could be further from the truth. But, part of the game is to keep Fox out there to argue Republican issues and, the other networks out there to argue sort of left-of-center arguments, as long as the left and the right aren't too far askew from what the ruling elite wants. They rather like that because it keeps everybody, knocking fists and knocking each other around and not really focusing on what's really important, I think.
Absolutely.
The stuff we talk about here, I think, and what I talk about also in the financial realm, when you get back to the real basic fundamental problems, you could say that in foreign policy and wars, we violated the Constitution by going to war without Congress declaring war. And certainly in the financial realm, we've violated the Constitution by by not following the definition of money as it's defined therein. So
Absolutely.
those are very basic things that the mainstream has long ago forgotten about, has thrown completely away. But until we come back to those things, we're going to have a mess. It's just not going to get better, I'm afraid. So anyway, thank you again, Daniel, for being with us, and we'll look forward to doing it again next week, I hope.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for having me.